Hello everyone and welcome to the next section, and this is our DonationX code walkthrough version 5. So we're looking at integrating now kind of multi-user support through Firebase Authentication into our donation example. We're still working with retrofit, we're still working with the node server. So just as a kind of just a quick recap, just to kind of remind ourselves of the server that we're going to be accessing, which is this here, slightly different name. So that's one of the changes that you'll need to make in the lab when you actually go to implement this. And also we now have to be able to identify an individual user. We're going to keep it pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and we're going to just use a basic email. So we're kind of modifying the endpoints. So for argument's sake, this one here, /donations, and then with an email passed as a parameter, we'll get all the particular user's donations. Likewise, we can get an individual donation belonging to the user. So each of them will require this extra parameter, the email, which is what the email that the user will register with. Okay, so one of the other changes we will need to make is, because now we're going to be getting back this JSON string, a donation object which will include that email. Also, we've added an upvotes as well, just to show we can just add in some extra parameters there, and something we can use later on in our example. We will need to modify our own model as well. So again, I'll take you through that in the lab, the changes that you need to make. The service does exactly the same. We can still add, update, delete. We can list them all and look for kind of a single donation. But now it's all for an individual user. Okay. So kind of the steps to integrate Firebase and specifically Firebase Authentication into your app is as follows. So you create your project, set up your sign-in method, set up your Firebase in your app. Again, I would have taken you through all that, so hopefully you have that done already. So what I'm going to look at in this little section is just the specific authentication classes and the kind of changes that we need to make, and then in some examples where we use then that authenticated user. So we'll just kind of look at the authentication flow and then how we use the authenticated user within the app itself. Okay, won't actually be a full walkthrough, just kind of highlighting the most important bits. Okay, so in our project, this is what we have now at the moment. Color's gone a bit funny there again now. Okay, so I'm introducing this Firebase Auth Manager class. I was looking a while and just kind of doing some research on the best way to implement this. So there are a number of different ways to do this, but the links I've came across, and I think I have it in the lab as well, I thought was quite nice, quite easy enough to follow, and obviously includes the MVVM pattern, because that's what we're trying to kind of stick with in our app. Okay, so what we have is a couple of properties. We have an application object we're going to keep track of, because we want this to be application wide. We want, and we'll see later on how we use this and use the view model and share the view model across different fragments, because we want to be able to authenticate the user anywhere inside our app, not just within the scope of an individual fragment, but the scope of the whole application. So what we also have is we have a Firebase Auth instance, which we're going to get from our Firebase console. We're going to keep track of a live Firebase user. So this is what we're going to kind of observe within our view model, but this is the approach we're taking. So we're going to keep it a little bit separate, and we're going to have another instance which ties into this Firebase Auth Manager inside our view model. And you can see there's mutable live data of type Firebase user. So this is a type coming from the Firebase the SDK itself. So you need to make sure that you have the dependencies and have it all set up, or it's just you get errors within your project because this type won't exist. Okay, we're also going to keep track of a logged out and an error status. Again, mutable live data, but just simple booleans that we will turn on and turn off, true or false, as to whether or not the user's logged in or logged out. Okay, within this class itself, 4 other functions there. We have kind of the initial init, so when our Firebase Auth Manager is created, this is what we want to happen, and then we have a login, register, and a log out, which will basically tie back directly to the Firebase functions and those particular methods for logging in for registering with a basic email and password that I would have covered in previous sections. Okay, so if we just kind of look at those in a little bit more detail. So the classes themselves. So here's our init. So what do we do in the init? There we look. We grab our application object. We get that Firebase Auth instance. Okay, and then we just do a check here to see, are we logged in already? Do we already have a current user? Right, and if we don't, if we do, should I say, if our current user is not null, right, we update the live Firebase user's value. So again, this is slightly something different now. When we want to assign a particular value and make sure it's going to be observed correctly, we can use the .post value, and then we pass and set it to this Firebase Auth .current user. Again, this .current user is coming from the Firebase, that's a Firebase object, Firebase instance, so to speak. Okay, and then we have our own ones here, logged out, and then error status. Okay, that we're setting. Again, we're just using those just to keep track of when the user is logged in or not, and if there's any errors when trying to connect to our Firebase and trying to authenticate. So okay, some of the other methods. Again, I mix and match with methods functions, so we're all basically talking about the same thing. Okay, here's our register. Excuse me. I kind of look at this again in the walkthrough of the application running, but here we are tying directly into the create user with email and password. That's coming directly from the developer docs. A method that we can use on our Firebase Auth instance to go and create, or in our case we want to register. So we're just passing in an email and we're passing in a password that we will have gotten from the UI itself, passed through the view model and then into our Firebase Auth manager to go off and actually make those connections. Okay, just checking to make sure everything worked okay. So if there's a callback there on our task instance, task object there passed in. So if that's okay, we update our Firebase user again just to make sure it's all correct, because this is a register process. Okay, otherwise just throw a little error back. Okay, and then in the logged in, that was just, I suppose that was our register. Did we look at I think we looked at our logged in. There's our login. So again, sign in with email and password. Same method that we would have covered in the material. Same one you'll come across in the developer docs if you want to have a look at them. So if the login is successful, so this is you're going through the initial kind of the login screen, the login UI, and we'll look at that now in a minute as well. Same crack as before. Just make sure we set the user, update the live Firebase user, because this is what we're observing inside our fragments. So anytime it changes, that will update, which means we can keep track of which user happens to be signed in on the app. Okay, and for logging out, we're just call our sign out on our auth instance and then update the logged out and error status properties accordingly. Okay, in terms of the view model itself now, so our logged in, we again separated these a little bit. This could all be wrapped up in one particular view model, but following the tutorial, and if you look at the links themselves, it does kind of make sense to separate out those different particular use cases, because registering is a little bit different actually than logged in. Okay, so you'll see a lot of the same code, but there's reasoning behind that. Okay, excuse me. So with our logged in view model, just keeping track of a few other properties there again. We have our Firebase Auth Manager instance, and there we are. So again, notice that we are extending from Android view model because we want to get in at the application object. Okay, so this app, that's kind of an implicit application object that we can pass in to our a logged in view model instance, which in turn then will allow us to create that Firebase Auth Manager, which ultimately will allow us to keep track of the Firebase user, authenticated user, across the whole app. Okay, here we are. Here's the live Firebase user inside our view model, and this is what we're going to keep track of. And then we update it with the Firebase Auth Manager property, the live Firebase user. And likewise with the logged out, and that has the logged in has one other function, has just one function. Our log out, we might come back to this, we might revisit this later on, do some more with it, but for the moment, all we want to do is trigger a logout, excuse me, which will again sign out the user from Firebase. Okay. The login register, very similar properties. So again, you could see we could kind of combine these together, but just for the separate use cases, it makes sense to keep these view models separate, because if you think about it, the view model is really should be just doing one job. So there's a different scenarios for being logged in and returning to the app and staying logged in, right? As opposed to registering. Okay, so here we have our login and our register functions. So again, triggering within the Firebase Auth Manager.login, and also the register, which will trigger the .register on our Firebase Auth Manager. Okay. In terms of the login flow itself, okay, so this is the activity, and again, I've wrapped it up inside a kind of an auth package to try and stay in line and be consistent with the different features that we have with our detail, our donate. So again, we have the fragment and the view model tied up with that. So even though this is an activity, I'm keeping it all bundled up together in an overall auth package. Okay, so that in theory, if you needed to, you could pull out that package, bring it into your own application, and you could more or less have Firebase authentication and able to plug it in if you're following the MVVM, and should be able to implement it without too much trouble. Okay, so here in our login class, we have our login register view model, and then to be able to access the view model itself and get at the underlying data and our authenticated user, and our login binding to be able to access the buttons on the screen. We'll have a look at it now in a minute, but basically we have our two buttons. We have our sign in button and our create account button. So we'll look at that. We have a couple of other functions there, or on start or on back pressed, and we have then kind of dedicated specifically for dealing with creating our accounts, signing in, checking the status, and some form validation, just making sure that the email is entered, that the user is not trying to sign in with kind of invalid emails and all the rest of it. So if we just have a look at some of those functions in a little bit more detail. Okay, so what do we do when the login activity actually starts, right? So the first thing we do is we get an instance of our view model, our login register view model. Okay, and we observe that live Firebase user, and if that Firebase user is not null, so this means it already exists. Okay, and we have logged in before, but we haven't signed out, so it is kind of an active user. We jump straight to the home class, so we bypass the login already, which is what would be expected in a particular use case. So most apps that you're using, if you're already signed into the app, you would hope and expect to be taken straight into the app or to the home page or wherever you left off for that matter, if you haven't signed out. So that's what we're doing with this and keeping track of in this particular kind of scenario. Okay. And then we check the status just to make sure, keep track that any messages coming back from Firebase are all okay. In terms of creating an account, so again, that's tied to the kind of the login in buttons. Okay, so this one here, we create account, we create our sign in. Okay, so again, so if in this case maybe the user has signed out, okay, so the user does exist. But we want to either sign in or we want to create a new account. So this is the first time the user is going to use your app. Previous scenario, they're already signed in, they haven't signed out, so when they launch the app again, they're taken directly into and to the home screen. So in here, quite simple, straightforward approach, one line of code within the create account. So once the form is okay, our validate form is fine, we trigger the register, passing in the email and password that the user has entered, and this email and password will have been retrieved from the edit text on the layout itself, And then if they happen to be signing in, so they would have signed out, but it already exists, we take them through and we trigger the .login with that same email and password. And that goes back to the view model, which in turn triggers the relevant methods in our Firebase Auth manager, which goes back then directly up to Firebase, authenticates, and comes back with a success or otherwise. Okay, so at this point, we can via the view model, we will know whether the user has been successfully signed in or successfully created or whatever. Okay. So to look at the kind of just the screenshot there, what we're getting is there's our button. So this is the UI. I give you most of this in the lab itself. So you're more than welcome to change it if you want. But here's just those two buttons. There's our sign in. There's our create. So the assumption is if the user is signing in, that the email and password already exist and are valid. Whereas if create account, it's a new account, so this will be a new email and this will be a new password that are registered and a new user set up on your console. So the first time you obviously test this, you will be creating an account. If you try and sign in, you should get back error message to say invalid password, sorry, unable to sign in user or whatever. Okay, so this is just the login activity. Okay, now once we're logged in, we're going to be looking at the home screen. Okay, so again, following the scenario here, the user has already been created or has already been has signed in and has taken straight to the home screen. But same as before, we want to make sure that the only user, an authenticated user, can access the home screen, so that there's not some way of trying to bypass the login and trying to access the home screen without being properly authenticated. So we bind to our view model instance, we observe the live Firebase user of that, and if that Firebase user is not null, so if we do have a Firebase user instance, so in this case it will be authenticated, we will have a correct email user with a validated email, we call update nav header, passing in the live Firebase user. Now at the moment, all this will do will set up and assign the email in the nav header, but later on we will do a little bit more with it. So but for the moment, that's all we're doing in this version of the application, and I'll show you what it looks like on the next screen. We also have our logged out, so just keeping track to make sure that if the user does sign out, so our logged out mutable live data changes and updates to a true property. So if logged out is true, what we do is we take them straight back to the login screen. If you want to do something else, you can. If you want to take them somewhere else, you can. But in this instance, what I'm doing is, in this particular example, just take them straight back to the login screen. Okay. So once they're signed in, what the nav header looks something like this in our home screen. Just simple as that. Just the basic email. So here we're dealing with Bart. So Bart would have signed in. We would have authenticated against Firebase, got back successful sign in, and then take the user to the home screen and display their email. Later on, when we work with Google sign in, we'll actually be able to display their Google email address, their Google username, and their actual Google profile as well. But again, that's for later versions. Okay. In terms of where to next, so if we look at our nav graph, so the way I have it set up is, if you can remember, our report screen, report layout is kind of like the home screen, it's the home fragment that they get, and from there the user can navigate. If they hit the FAB, their floating action button, they can navigate to our donate fragment, or if they click on a row, they are taken to the donation detail fragment. But again, remember, we want to make sure that if the user tries to access any of these screens, which are a separate fragment, that they are still authenticated and it's still a valid user. So we need to modify slightly how we access and how we bind to our view models within those particular fragments. Okay, so that's this, and this is how we do it. Okay, so instead of just declaring the view model up top, and then binding to it later on, generally in the start or the on create view. What we do is we declare it by activity view models, and this is a very useful extension function, right? What it does is, right, it allows we use this when the fragment is sharing data or communicating with another activity or fragment. So this allows us to be able to share this particular view model with other activities, so we can get at it directly, and any changes that are made even outside of observing the data, the live data, because that is only kind of available within the scope of the view model itself, which generally, the way we've been doing it now, is just within the fragment. What we want to do now is we want to be able to get at this outside that particular fragment and access the same view model data in another fragment. So how we allow that to happen is we use our extension function by activity view model. So again, we can just declare it up the top. That will do that first, and we don't have to point to it later on. We can then just go and directly observe it. Okay, so here we are in our onResume, which is inside our report. So what we do here is every time our report loads and resumes, we keep track just to make sure that that live Firebase user is authenticated, is logged in, and we update the live Firebase user property to that user, and then we reload, we just call .load on the view model itself, because remember, this is still tying back to our node server, which is now multi-user, which means it could be changed elsewhere, could even be changed on the server through a separate client if you happen to be signed in on another device. So this is just ensuring that we reload and pull down the most up-to-date data from the server when our report screen loads up. How that is triggered, again, just to remind ourselves, inside the view model itself, right, is like so. So here we are inside our load. So the changes, this is part of the lab as well. Some of the changes we need to make is we need to now pass in the email, okay, of the live Firebase user that we are dealing with, and this is within the view model. And remember, because this is live data and we're observing this, and it's part of the report view model, which we're now sharing. This is accessible anywhere across our application. So the part of the lab will involve modifying a lot of these calls to include the email. And again, just remember, because it's mutable data, we can't get in at the .email property directly. We get an error otherwise. We have to say .value .email or .value whatever that mutable field happens to be. So the .value will give us the overall donation, and then the .email will get at the email property of that particular donation. Okay, and again, remember, that's inside the report view model. The rest of them are kind of similar. If we look at our donation detail, so when we resume that, one simple call, we call get donation, but again, passing in, we say that the view model instance, we get at the live Firebase user .value .email. So we're getting at the specific email of the authenticated user who was part and maintained inside that logged in view model. And also there's our args.donation ID. So again, we will have covered our safe args. So this has been passed directly from the report screen to the donation screen or donation detail via those safe args, and again, all done through the nav graph, and we would have set up that particular function. So we pass in the ID on a report screen to the function. All that transaction, all that's looked after behind the scenes within the nav graph. So we just need to access it like so. Again, I would take you through some of that in the lab too. Okay. And that was our donation detail. In the view model itself, excuse me, there's the get donation function, taking the email, taking the ID, and there we are triggering our donation manager again, passing in now the extra parameter, the email, which ties back to our retrofit interface, which requires that email to go up, hit the server, look for the ID, but matching the email also. Okay, and then that will just display the that will update the UI and display it accordingly. Okay. In terms of our donation detail, some of the extra buttons there dealing with edit, and there's our, hang on, sorry, color's gone again on me. So here we are binding to our edit button and binding to our delete button. Again, I'll show you them now on the next screen. But the code in behind it, here we are again, all done through the view model again, just triggering. Remember, this is on our layout, and the rules kind of with MVVM dictate that all you really should be doing is triggering methods from your view model. So here we are just calling the .update donation, passing in quite a lot of properties. So here we are, our update donation, we pass in the email of the authenticated user, we pass in the ID from our safe args, and using our two-way data binding, we get directly at the donation VM object that we passed in as data into our layout, get at the observable donation, the live data that we're tracking, and then dot value, which is the whole donation. So what that ensures is when the user is in edit mode, so you've clicked on your report screen, you've loaded up the detail, you can change that detail directly, and then simply with this one call here, we can then update that. So we're extracting the data directly from the layout. So there's our two-way data binding. So we can populate it by clicking on it and displaying it. And because we're using our two-way data binding, if the user changes it on that screen and then hits and selects the edit button, that will trigger this here, which will go off and update the particular donation. And again, we just make sure that we load our report model again, just to make sure that we're guaranteed a refresh, and we navigate back to where we came from. Okay. Likewise, we do the same with our delete. Don't need to pass in as much information this time. All we need is the ID from that observable donation object for deleting. For updating, we have to actually pass in all the new data. Okay, and again, it's a little bit brute force here. We're passing up the whole object. I suppose different versions, different implementations might only pass up the individual field that you want to update, but I felt this would just make it a bit easier to understand. So again, it's the whole data that we are retrieving via our two-way data binding from the layout, passing it into our edit donation button here. Again, that's the callback, the on-click listener callback for both edit and delete. Okay, so what that looks like here is something like so. So here we have here. So if you can think about it, the user has, from the report, has selected a particular donation. So you can see here, so we can navigate back if we want to. Here's our donation detail. So these fields have been passed to the layout. Direct, a message, and an upvotes value have been passed to the donation detail view model, which in turn has updated, it's through the fragment, and then that's extracted the data. We've done our lookup in our view model, and because of our two-way data binding, if and when the user changes this property or this property or this property here and clicks edit, it will update it and will push it back up and trigger those events back on the server and update accordingly, which in turn will go back to our report, load up the new one, and we navigate back as well. Okay, so just to look at the on the layout itself, kind of an aside really. So this is important here. The @ equals, that allows the two-way data binding to take place. So for this example here, this is our edit message. So this would have been loaded up. So when we would have clicked on and we would have navigated to the layout, we would have passed in our donation VM. This is again via the adapter and all the rest of it. And then so we would be getting at the message property of the observable donation. That's our mutable live data. So that's an individual donation. But most importantly, when the user changes this message our edit message, to change the value here, because of our two-way data binding, it's automatically updated in that donation VM instance, and then specifically the observable donation. So again, just to go back to that screen again, where are we gone? Where are we? Back here. This here, there's our donation VM. So that will contain the updated value, including that message that was changed and all the rest. So this here is a full donation that we're passing up to our and calling on our update donation function, which is inside our DetailViewModel, which in turn triggers the retrofit interface, which in turn makes the call on the server. Okay, so I suppose what we end up with is this. Now again, we don't have we'll implement the slide swipe to edit in the next version. We do have swipe to delete working on this one. And other than that, it all goes back to our console. So again, just make sure that if you do download the solution to this, make sure that it's your google-services.json file you're working with, and it's your console, because they're going to authenticate against your console, not my console. Okay, and that's all that kind of metadata, all that configuration information is inside that google-services.json file. Okay, a couple of references there for you, worth having a look at. As always, any kind of issues or whatever, any questions I might have on what I've covered there now, please reach out to me on Slack or over email, and hopefully when you tackle the lab, again, you won't have too many problems. Okay, so other than that, thanks for listening, and goodbye.